On Christmas Day 1872, as the streets of London bustled with festive cheer and homes brimmed with laughter and holiday feasts, a horrifying discovery was unfolding in a modest lodging house on Great Coram Street. This gruesome event would shatter the holiday peace and shockwaves through Victorian society and leave behind a mystery that still defies explanation. It all began just past noon, when Mrs. Harriet Wright, the landlady of number 12 Great Coram Street in Bloomsbury, approached her tenant's door with a deepening sense of unease. Harriet Buswell, a ballet dancer from the Alhambra Theatre, had not been seen since returning home late on Christmas Eve with a gentleman. Her absence was worrisome, and her silence even more so. Mrs. Wright knocked repeatedly, calling out, "Miss Buswell, are you quite well? Please answer." But there was only silence. Fear growing into dread, she called for assistance. I hope everyone helps me with a like and a subscription, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. Together they forced open the door, locked from the outside, the key mysteriously missing. What they found would haunt them forever. Harriet Buswell lay sprawled across the bed, her blood soaking the sheets, her throat savagely slashed down to the bone. A bloody handprint marked her forehead, evidence that someone had violently held her down as her life was taken. "God save us! Murder! Murder in my house!" screamed Mrs. Wright. The joyful day had turned into a scene of horror at number 12, but who was this tragic figure Harriet Buswell? Born around 1845 in the fenlands of Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, she had come to London, like many young women of her time, chasing the dream of a better life. By her late 20s, she had become a ballet dancer at the Grand Alhambra Theatre in Leicester Square, performing under the names Clara Burton or Clara Brutin. Yet behind the glamour of the stage, her life was one of instability and constant financial struggle. On the night before her death, she borrowed a shilling from a fellow lodger before heading out. She owed rent to Mrs. Wright 9 shillings, which she managed to pay shortly before her murder using a half-sovereign coin. But her responsibilities didn't end there. Poor Harriet, she works twice as hard as any of us. "She has the little one to think of, you see," said a fellow dancer. That little one was her daughter Kate, born around 1864. Supporting a child added to Harriet's burdens. Like many performers of the era, she sometimes turned to prostitution to make ends meet. This aspect of her life, while common, would shape both the public perception of her death and the course of the investigation. In the rigid moral climate of Victorian London, where women were expected to be domestic angels while men roamed the public sphere, women like Harriet, those outside the boundaries of so-called respectability, were both shunned and vulnerable. Victorian London officially counted 8,600 prostitutes, but historians estimate the true number may have reached 80,000. For many working-class women, particularly actresses and dancers, selling sex was less a moral failing and more a means of survival. These unfortunate women are victims twice over, first of circumstance, then of society's cruel judgment, noted one reformer. Their deaths were often dismissed, their lives deemed less valuable by those in power. Harriet's neighbourhood Bloomsbury was emblematic of a shifting London. Once home to the elite, it had by the 1870s become more mixed in class, with places like number 12 offering basic shelter to performers, clerks and labourers struggling to stay afloat. The final day of Harriet Buswell's life, Christmas Eve, can be traced with chilling clarity. Around 10:10 p.m, she left her lodgings after borrowing that shilling and made her way to the Alhambra Theatre. There, under the warm glow of chandeliers and the bustle of the evening crowd, she met a man who would soon become the focus of a citywide manhunt. Witnesses described him as a foreigner, likely German, distinguished by his accent and refined appearance. Later, the two dined at the Caviar restaurant. Waiter William Stalker remembered serving them. After their meal, the pair took an omnibus from Piccadilly Circus toward Bloomsbury, sharing the ride with a barmaid from the Alhambra, who would later provide key testimony. Before returning to number 12, they stopped at George Fleck's grocery shop to buy fruit and nuts, perhaps a simple gesture for a cosy night, or perhaps supplies for something far more sinister. "Yes, I remember them clearly," said Fleck. "The lady was a regular. The man, though a foreigner, educated, respectable even. They bought apples and nuts, seemed merry like any couple on Christmas." By midnight, they had returned to Great Coram Street. Harriet Buswell's life ended hours later brutally and without mercy, and so the mystery remains. Who was the man with the German accent? What secrets did he carry with him into that room? And why, even after all these years, does no one know his name? Mrs. Wright was still awake when the pair returned to the lodging house, quietly observing their arrival. Harriet Buswell appeared cheerful and untroubled, and without hesitation she settled her overdue rent 9 shillings by handing over a half-sovereign. The gesture would later fuel speculation about robbery as a potential motive, considering that she clearly had money just hours before her violent death. He was a fine-looking man, well-dressed, respectable. "I saw nothing to concern me, God help me, not a thing," Mrs. Wright later testified. What happened behind the closed door of Buswell's room that night remains cloaked in mystery, but by approximately 6:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, someone heard the German-speaking man quietly exiting the building. By then, Harriet Buswell lay lifeless inside her room, her life stolen in a frenzy of blood and violence. The crime scene investigators encountered later that day was shockingly gruesome, a jarring contrast to the season's joy. According to the Times, the bed bore a dreadful appearance soaked in blood that testified to the ferocity of the attack. Her throat had been slashed with such force that the blade reached the bone, a detail that would later invite chilling comparisons to the Jack the Ripper murders, which wouldn't occur until 16 years later. This was no moment of panic, this was rage, or perhaps something colder, more calculating. A bloody handprint stamped across her forehead revealed that someone had pinned her down during the murder. Her death would have been swift, yes, but not before she faced unspeakable fear, the police surgeon grimly concluded. One of the most curious pieces of evidence was a partially eaten apple. Investigators displaying an early grasp of forensic innovation created a cast of the bite marks and determined they did not match Buswell's dental structure. Though the crude attempt at what we now call forensic odontology offered little help then, it hinted at the future of criminal science. Blood-smeared towels and handkerchiefs were strewn around the room, possibly used by the killer to clean himself or disguise the crime. Most disturbingly, the door had been locked from the outside. The key deliberately removed strong evidence of premeditation. Several of Buswell's belongings were missing, including jewellery and a pawn ticket suggesting robbery. Yet the half-sovereign she'd used to pay her rent hours before complicated that narrative. She'd had money, so why steal anything at all? The contradiction deepened the mystery rather than clarified it. The murder quickly ignited public fascination and the Metropolitan Police sprang into action. Superintendent Thompson of E Division led the hunt for the killer. On December the 26th, the Times reported on the slaying at Great Coram Street, and within hours a full-fledged manhunt was underway. But in an age without fingerprint analysis, DNA, or even basic autopsy techniques, investigators were forced to depend on the fallible clarity of human memory. Witnesses described the man last seen with Buswell as foreign, likely German, in his early 30s, well-dressed and educated. "We are seeking a gentleman of foreign appearance, German in speech, approximately 30 years of age, and refined in manner. Anyone with knowledge of this man's whereabouts on Christmas Eve must come forward," Superintendent Thompson declared. To encourage tips, authorities offered a reward of £200, a massive sum at the time, equal to over £22,000 today. The promise of money stirred public interest and prompted a flood of leads, though not all were given in good faith. Some came forward hoping for compensation, muddying the waters of an already elusive investigation. The investigation brought forth a steady stream of witnesses, each adding a critical piece to the puzzle of Harriet Buswell's final hours, and the elusive man who had accompanied her. George Fleck, the greengrocer, vividly remembered selling fruit to the couple that night. A waiter at the Cavour restaurant confirmed he had served them dinner. A barmaid from the Alhambra Theatre recalled sharing an omnibus ride with Buswell, and the man she described as foreign, well-dressed, and distinctly German in speech. And of course, Mrs. Wright had personally witnessed their return to the lodging house. All accounts aligned in their description, and it was this consistency that soon led police to a startling lead. In January 1873, the investigation took an unexpected turn when it led detectives to the German ship Wangland, docked at Ramsgate undergoing repairs. The vessel was preparing to transport settlers to Brazil, part of an effort to establish a new German colony. Among the crew were two men who drew immediate interest from the authorities: Karl Volb, the ship's assistant surgeon, and Gottfried Hessel, the chaplain. "I am Inspector Harnett of the Metropolitan Police. I must request that all gentlemen of the ship's company present themselves for identification in connection with a grave matter," the inspector declared as he boarded the vessel. Accompanied by witnesses from London, Inspector Harnett was prepared to conduct an identification parade that would mark a pivotal moment in the case. Initially, suspicion focused on Karl Volbe and he was arrested, but what followed stunned everyone present. One by one, the witnesses turned their attention not to Volb, but to Dr. Gottfried Hessel. "That's him, the tall one with the solemn expression?" "I'd stake my life on it," whispered one witness. The identification of a man of God as the prime suspect in a brutal murder sent shockwaves through both the British public and the German expatriate community. Dr. Hessel, a 31-year-old clergyman from Prussia ordained in 1867, now stood accused of the horrific Christmas Day killing of Harriet Buswell. On January 29, 1873, Dr. Gottfried Hessel appeared before the magistrate at Bow Street. The case built against him relied heavily on the recollections of witnesses. Of the 7 individuals at the identification parade, 5 had unhesitatingly identified Hessel as the man seen with the victim. That is the man who bought fruit with her, insisted George Fleck. The gentleman I served supper to was that very same man, confirmed William Stalker, the waiter from the Cavora restaurant. These accounts placed the defendant in the presence of the deceased on the night she was slain, argued the prosecution, emphasizing the alignment of testimonies. But Hessel didn't remain silent. He presented a robust alibi, insisting he'd been unwell and bedridden at Kroll's Hotel in America's Square, London, on the night of December 24th. His claim wasn't unsupported. Multiple individuals, including Karl Volb himself, testified on his behalf. Volb stated he had seen Hessel in the hotel dining room at around 8:30 p.m. and noted that he appeared very ill, to the extent that Volb had prescribed him medication. Then came the defence's thunderous counterstrike. The witnesses you see before you, Your Honour, have not been illuminated by the sun or the gaslight, but by the gleam of a £200 reward, declared Mr. Broadst, Straight Hessel's defence counsel. Their memories have been moulded not by honesty but by greed. The courtroom burst into spontaneous applause, a reaction that mirrored the growing public doubt surrounding the prosecution's case. Yet the evidence wasn't entirely circumstantial. Jane Summers, a housekeeper at the Royal Hotel in Ramsgate, testified that after returning from London following the holidays, Hessel had asked for turpentine to clean his clothes and sent handkerchiefs badly stained with blood to be laundered. It was a claim that cast a dark shadow over his alibi, introducing the possibility that Hessel's hands were not as clean as his clerical collar suggested. Despite the dramatic testimonies and the suspicion cast upon him, the case against Dr. Gottfried Hessel ultimately unravelled. Having weighed the evidence presented, I find it insufficient to commit the accused for trial. Dr. Gottfried Hessel is hereby discharged without suspicion, ruled Magistrate James Vaughan. It was January 29, 1873. Just like that, Hessel walked free and the prosecution's case collapsed in full view of the press and the public. By January 31st, the Morning Post was reporting on his release and public opinion turned sharply in his favour. Support for the clergyman poured in from across the nation. A public subscription raised an astonishing £1.224 to help him recover from the ordeal, with Queen Victoria herself contributing £30. Even Prime Minister Gladstone issued a personal letter of apology. But while the case may have been closed for Hessel, it remained far from solved. The identity of Harriet Buswell's killer was still unknown. Not long after Hessel's release, an anonymous letter from Germany emerged, painting a far less flattering portrait of the clergyman. According to its author, Hessel had previously been dismissed from a congregation due to issues with debt and drinking details that challenged his virtuous image. Though this revelation arrived too late to impact the legal proceedings, it cast a long shadow over the public's earlier rush to canonize him. Meanwhile, the investigation into Buswell's murder had ground to a halt. Lacking the forensic tools we now take for granted, the Metropolitan Police found themselves at a dead end. The investigation remains open, though. I confess our avenues of inquiry have narrowed considerably. We shall continue to pursue any legitimate information that might bring Miss Buswell's murderer to justice, the police commissioner stated solemnly. And so the case slipped into obscurity, another unsolved horror in the fog of Victorian crime. For nearly a century and a half, the murder of Harriet Buswell would remain an unsettling mystery until a surprising new theory emerged from across the globe. In 2019, researcher Stanley Bruce put forward a striking hypothesis that reignited interest in the case. He proposed that the man responsible for Buswell's murder may have been Wilhelm Krauss, a German national who boarded the British ship Rifleman under the alias William Cross just 2 days after the murder. Bruce's timeline was chilling in its precision. December 25th, 1872, Harriet Buswell is murdered in London. December 28th, 1872, the Rifleman departs for Sydney with Krauss posing as William Cross signed on as steward. A German man fleeing England under a false name mere days after a murder attributed to a German-speaking suspect. The implications are hard to ignore, Bruce noted, but Krauss's story didn't end with a quiet life in the colonies. It took a far darker turn, adding a bloody epilogue to the Buswell tragedy. On March 16, 1873, while the Rifleman was still en route to Australia, Wilhelm Krauss committed another horrific act. He murdered Captain James Rash Longmuir aboard the ship. The brutality of this second killing would raise new and damning questions about his involvement in the crime that had shocked London only weeks earlier. The events aboard the Rifleman revealed not only Wilhelm Krause's capacity for violence, but also his cold and calculated nature. Before taking the life of Captain James Rash Longmuir, Krause had attempted to poison the entire crew by lacing their food and grog with narcotics. It wasn't just a murder, it was a plan to seize control of the vessel. At his trial, the judge described a cunningly devised plan to obtain possession of the ship, referencing the alarming evidence found in Krause's quarters: 7 neatly prepared cords, a stash of revolvers and a dagger, and the long iron bolt he had used to assault the chief officer. Wilhelm Krause, you have been found guilty of the murder of Captain James Rash Longmuir. You shall be taken from this place to the place from whence you came, and then to a place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul, the Sydney judge pronounced solemnly. On July 1st, 1873, just over 6 months after the murder of Harriet Buswell, Wilhelm Krause was hanged at Darlinghurst Gaol for a different killing one committed thousands of miles from the blood-soaked bed in Great Coram Street. If Stanley Bruce's theory holds true, then justice for Harriet Buswell may have come not in London's courts, but beneath the gallows in Sydney. Bruce suggested that the bite mark found on the apple at the Buswell crime scene could in theory be matched to Krause's dental remains. Since Krause was buried in Australia following his execution, forensic odontological testing could offer a definitive answer, but that analysis has never been conducted. As a result, the theory remains persuasive yet officially unresolved. Today, Great Coram Street in Bloomsbury carries little hint of the horror that unfolded there on Christmas Day 1872. The flickering gas lamps have been replaced by modern lighting horse-drawn omnibuses, by humming engines, and the modest lodging houses by apartments and offices. Yet Harriet Buswell's story continues to echo through time, revealing stark truths about the world she inhabited. Her murder lays bare the precarious position of working-class women in Victorian England, especially those like Harriet who occupied the blurred space between the stage and the street. As both a theatre performer and an occasional prostitute, Harriet lived a life on society's margins, a life where violence was often met with silence, and the deaths of so-called fallen women rarely drew outrage. The Buswell case reveals how deeply class, gender, and perceptions of morality influenced both the direction of police investigations and the reactions of the public. The outpouring of sympathy and fundraising for Dr. Hessel, a respectable clergyman, starkly contrasts with the relative indifference shown toward Harriet, the victim herself. The treatment of the two reveals more about the era's values than the crime itself, one historian observes. If Bruce's connection between Krause and the Buswell case is indeed accurate, then this is more than a murder mystery. It's a historical thread tying together 2 brutal crimes on opposite sides of the globe. The fact that this link remained buried for nearly 50 years highlights both the limitations of 19th century international policing and the power of modern research to bring new light to the forgotten corners of the past. Harriet Buswell, dancer, mother, and murder victim, may never see her case officially closed, but through the possible fate of Wilhelm Krause, she may have received some measure of justice. Her story stands not merely as a lurid crime tale, but as a mirror to the society that shaped her fate, a society whose shadows still stretch into our own time. Christmas Day, 1872. As London celebrated, Harriet's life came to a brutal end. More than a century later, her death continues to provoke questions, empathy, and awe. A Victorian mystery perhaps answered not in a British courtroom, but beneath the noose in a distant Sydney prison. If this haunting tale gripped you, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories and forgotten mysteries from history that still resonate today. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.